So, in today's lesson, as said in the previous one, we will have a look at the augments and reduplications. We have already talked about it when they are being used, but here is a quick reminder. So, as for the augments, those are for the secondary tenses or historical tenses, imperfect, aorist, and plusquamperfect. And, important, used only in the indicative. Now, you may wonder again, what is with the perfect, who is clearly a historical tense? Well, the perfect does not use augmentation, but instead is using reduplication, and this not only in the indicative, but in general. So, starting with the augments, here we have this lovely table, and don't worry, we will go through step by step. As you can see, on the left side we are starting with the initial sounds. Then we have the type. As you can see, we have two different types. And actually, only the consonants are syllabic. All of the vowels and diphthongs are temporal. We will see what that means in just a moment. And then we have the rule, or more specifically the lengthening for most of the initial sounds. And lastly, we have the example, here from present to past. So, starting with the consonant. If the initial sound of a verb stem is a consonant, except rota, we are simply adding the prefix e. For example, lyo becomes e lyon. If, however, it starts with rota, then it is almost the same, except that we are doubling the rota. But the prefix e still remains. For example, ripto becomes eripton with a double rota. Next, we have the alpha as well as the alpha longa, a long alpha version. Both of those lengthening to eta. For example, akuo becomes akuon. Then epsilon. This also lengthens to eta, in very rare cases even to eta iota, which might be an e sound. This rare case usually happens because an original consonant, like a sigma, was lost between the augment and the stem, causing them to contract. But don't worry about this. Anyway, back to the examples. Here we have el pizzo becomes el pizzon. Similarly, echo becomes econ. Next we have a omicron. This, you guessed it, simply lengthens to omega. For example, onomazzo becomes onomazzon. Next we have the iota and ypsilon, but pay attention. Those are the short versions, indicated here with the symbol on top. Those, as you probably guessed, simply lengthens to the long version, iota and ypsilon longa. Here, for example, hiketeuo becomes hiketeuon. Usually, the symbol on top that indicates a short vowel is left out. Next, we have the diphthongs, starting with the pairing alpha iota and epsilon iota. Here, they become eta subscriptum, iota subscriptum that is. I will talk about the subscriptum in just a moment. So, for example, aiteo becomes eituon, and a cazzo becomes a cazzon. The next pairing is alpha y and epsilon y, which would make an EU sound rather than EU. This becomes EU with the eta y. The epsilon y sometimes remains as epsilon y. But, for example, Heorisco becomes Heoriskon. Here it does change. Next we have the omikron iota. This becomes omega iota subscriptum. For example, oikeo becomes oikon. And lastly, this one is special. Omikron and y. Here we don't have a change. So, for example, utazzo becomes utazon. Now, a quick note on the iota subscriptum. So, first, for the diphthongs, which would be either alpha, iota, epsilon iota, or omicron iota, it is important to remember that when they lengthen to eta or omega, the iota does not disappear. It becomes what is called iota subscriptum or iota subscript. Again, for example, aiteo becomes aton. Here, the iota moves underneath the eta. So, but if the iota is used with uppercase letter instead, we do not have a iota subscriptum, but a iota adscriptum. For example, those two words, which are identical in meaning. So, starting with the lowercase, we have aides. Here, the alpha has an iota subscriptum because it is underneath the alpha. If, however, we have a capital alpha, a so-called majuscule, we have still aides, but, as you notice, the iota subscriptum is now a iota adscriptum because it is now no longer underneath, but it is to the right of the, in this case, alpha. Also, since I'm teaching the Attic dialect, I am still pronouncing it. Yet, relatively short after the Attic dialect, round about the 4th and 5th century BC, the pronunciation of the iota subscriptum, as well as iota adscriptum, started to decline, but I will still pronounce it since I'm teaching the Attic dialect. Next, a small addition to the compound verbs. You see, compound verbs with a prepositional prefix, like for example es, k, or p. Here, the augment does not go at the very beginning. Instead, it goes between the preposition and the verb stem. For example, in the present, ek ballo. Here, no issues. But in the aorist, we have ex ballon. This k change to x before the augment is for easy pronunciation, and we already talked about this in the full tactical rule lesson. So, as you can see, the augment e is in between the prefix, which is in this case x, and the verb itself, ballon.